Hello and welcome, this time unmuted now, to our live Q&A session on youth participation. We have just shown a live premiere to give an introduction on this, and before we jump into the Q&A session, I'll quickly say a few things about your host here, Salto Participation and Information. My name is Georg Feiner. I'm the Youth Participation Coordinator here at SALTO-PI. SALTO-PI is one of 7 research centers, and we are working on European priority areas in the youth field. Each of the Salto research centers works with specific topics or regions, and we support national agencies for Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps in promoting the programs and also promoting the EU youth strategy, also connect with the use of the youth goals. Here at SALTO-PI, we work specifically on youth participation, on media information and critical thinking, as well as on promotion and outreach. I want to highlight 3 things that we do in the field of youth participation. We coordinate a European think tank on youth participation. We currently develop a youth participation strategy to foster youth participation in democratic life through the youth programs of the European Union. And also we develop a participation resource pool that is soon going to be launched. And one more thing that we're doing is we host webinars, and this one is the first in a series, and I will hand over at this point to my colleague Kadri, who coordinates this webinar series.
Hello everybody, I'm Kadri, and I'm working together with Georg in SALTO-PI. And as a start, I would just like to give you a little bit of information about how this Q&A session will work. So first of all, Q&A means question and answer. So we are expecting your questions in the field of youth participation, and you can ask them in the comments field in Facebook Live. So we will answer as many as we can, and we will also answer them in written format later on in participation research pool that Georg already mentioned, which we will also inform you when this is launched. It can be that we won't be able to answer all your questions, so we will really put our attention to see the most relevant and important and interesting questions. And this session will remain accessible in SALTO-PI Facebook page for time being. Now to the webinars. As Georg mentioned, we have planned a webinar thread for you, and the webinar thread name is Making Youth Participation Visible. This is the first opening session. It's a Q&A session to make the whole topic understandable and get ourselves in the same place in understanding. The next webinar will take place in 2 weeks, and this is the continuous thing. So in every 2 weeks, we have a webinar. Next one will look at youth participation in the field of sustainability, environmental activism, etc. So this will be held probably over Zoom, and we will launch this event very soon, today, maybe tomorrow, and you will get this information as well in SALTO-PI Facebook page. And the next one will tackle youth goals and also the promotion and project examples in youth participation field. And this is it from my side. I will give word back to Georg.
All right, I've prepared a particularly tricky question to get this started, because I'm really interested and curious what our youth researchers, what our experts have to say to this. So my question is, where is youth participation now? Where is youth participation in times of a global pandemic? How does this affect us? And what's your view on this?
Well, I can take a stab at it. Hi, everybody. My name is Cristina Bacalso. Like Georg had introduced, I'm a youth researcher based in Berlin, Germany. Of course, everybody knows and everyone is affected by the current COVID crisis. And what we wanted to think a bit more about is what does this mean in times of youth participation? Traditionally, we think of youth participation a lot about the things that we do in person together. We are able to gather in groups. We organize amongst each other or together with other civil society organizations. Sometimes we attend a city hall meeting or these kinds of things. But of course, we're facing quite a lot of restrictions right now. We, in many countries, are under lockdown. We're in our homes. We have shifted a lot of our schooling online. A lot of our socializing has also gone to digital. And, I think at first glance, it does actually appear that it is really constricting our ability to participate, even our ability to be more active in our social lives, in our communities, of course, is constrained by the fact that we have to be at home. But I think that we can still see some small examples of youth participation. And in my reflection, I think that what we're seeing is actually a growth of youth participation, which is really happening on even perhaps a micro scale. We can see, if we think and break down participation just in sort of its kind of simplest idea of a person participating to better the life of their community, we can see that at an individual scale, young people themselves choosing to stay home and choosing to social distance is itself an act of participation. We see that their choosing to stay home then helps to flatten the curve, which is what all of our communities are talking about these days. We also see some micro actions in also encouraging others to stay home, to encourage their members of family and friends to do the same, as well as other kind of micro actions such as hand washing and that sort of thing. And so while it benefits us specifically in this particular crisis because of the virus, the simple act of staying at home and washing your hands is also an act of solidarity, because you are also helping to reduce the spread of this virus among your community. And so I think that is a really interesting thing, which perhaps is going unnoticed. Other ways which we see young people perhaps participating is maybe the role that they can play within their families and micro communities, with perhaps trying to prevent the spread of misinformation. I'm sure that all of us can sympathize with receiving the fake news article from your mother or auntie in the WhatsApp group, and what is it that you can do about that? Perhaps young people also have a role in that, in helping to kind of having more access, and perhaps ideally also more knowledge to play an active role in stemming misinformation, and also combating that within their own communities. Maybe Dan also has some ideas about how youth participation is changing.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Dan Moxon. I'm a researcher based in the UK. I've been working in the field of youth participation, first as a youth worker and as a participation worker, and now as a researcher for about 20 years. I mean, I think the interesting thing to me is to think about space in all of this. What we're doing right now in this pandemic is closing down our public spaces. And young people being able to be active in the public realm, in the public space, is a really quite a crucial part of participation. It allows people to meet, it allows people to associate together, it allows people to connect and link together, even simple acts like holding a protest in a public space. So where does that leave participation if we don't have the public space anymore? Well, what's interesting, if you look at a lot of the climate movements, things like Fridays for Future, they're rapidly, they've always used online approaches anyway, but they're rapidly doing that. And so instead of public strikes, they're organizing digital strikes. But that's a really big shift. At a certain level, it's fantastic that people can connect, but it also moves things a little bit further away from the public eye, from decision making, into particular digital spaces, which aren't necessarily public, both in the sense they can't always be accessed by everyone, but also in the sense that they're happening in the auspices of private companies, things like Zoom, Facebook, which is quite symbolically quite different. And then I think the other thing to really bear in mind in all of this is the different levels of inequality in our society and how that's really coming to the fore now. One of the really important things for participation for me is that we link it really closely to inclusion, to equality, and that we're enabling people from any background, any class background, any income background to participate, to have their voice heard, to make a change in society. And I saw a meme that went around as a joke the other day that says, you know, in the new world, there's only 4 classes of people: Zoom users, billionaires, essential workers, and people who are sick. And in a way, you can look at this whole group of people who don't have access to the internet, or certainly don't have access to the sort of amounts of data you need to be able to take part in an online meeting through a Zoom chat, that are really now fundamentally excluded from a lot of our discussions and our conversations. And that's quite a worrying thing, I think. But I mean, that's also a very European thing. If you look at, say, practices in the global south, there are agencies like the UN who've always built child and young people's participation into the things that have happened around disaster and resilience work. And they see young people's participation as a really important part of dealing with any social changes and any massive catastrophes, for want of a better word. So I wouldn't think that just because there are other political priorities, things like the functioning of our healthcare services, that we should stop doing youth participation altogether right now. I think it's important to see young people, certainly in the coming few months, if not perhaps immediately now, as part of actors who could help solve and rebuild our society, particularly when we get to dealing with some of the economic fallout of COVID. That's absolutely the case for me. But I mean, it also remains to be seen a lot as well.
I would say to add on to that, Dan, also the way in which we have seen, you know, kind of these unorthodox ways of participation being organized is also different. A lot of the people who are maybe tuning in today are working with youth-led civil society or other youth organizations whose sole aim is to support youth participation, but yet are finding themselves constrained both by the lack of public space and also by having to go online. And so what has been also really interesting to see is much more kind of horizontal and spontaneous modes of organizing and participation, particularly the concept of mutual aid, which has, you know, gained a lot of currency in this time. For any of you who have not heard of it before, mutual aid is where simply a group of people organize to meet their own needs, and we can think about that sort of at a community-based level. And so this is often done outside of formal frameworks, outside of charities, outside of NGOs, and, you know, our structured youth organizations. One example that I've been seeing here a lot in Berlin, which has been very cool, is just simply the initiative of local people who have decided to pack food and toiletries into plastic bags and hanging them in certain areas where they put up a sign saying, you know, please take as you need. And the idea is that in this particular time, a lot of the services, basic services such as food banks, have been forced to shut down or have been forced to shift to only home delivery, which of course leaves out an entire population of those people who may not have a fixed address. And so, you know, the idea is, okay, well, what do we do then to help that part of the community? And this was quite a spontaneous thing which has happened, that has popped up all over the country, all over the city. And I think that we'll start to see more of those kinds of spontaneous sort of mutual aid actions also in the area of sewing masks for communities and that kind of thing.
Right. Dan, before you jump in, I would like to pick up on one question that comes from the audience. Katja from Berlin posed a question connecting to what you said beforehand. The question is, how do we keep young people engaged when confronted with consistent barriers that are basically larger structural problems? So what do you say to that?
How do we keep young? Well, I mean, that's a tough question to start with. So how do we keep people engaged when we're confronted with big structural problems, right? I mean, the radical in me wants to say that we change the structures. because a participation is about shifting power. Participation is about, it's not about teaching young people to behave or to act in a certain way so they fit into our society. For me, it's about reshaping and reforming our institutions, our policies, so that they work for young people, so that young people want to engage with them, so that young people feel connected with them, so that they feel they've got a relationship with them. Now, obviously, that's a lot harder than educating and motivating young people. You know, if you're running a small youth participation project with 5 or 6 people involved, for me to say, oh, do you know what you should do is overthrow the economic system and change the way the state works to keep them engaged is not very realistic, right? So I think what we have to do is be clear about the values in engaging people there, and be clear about honesty and authenticity around change. So being clear with the young people you're working with, what change they can hope to make through your work, and being committed to change. Because you can never promise that they'll be able to shift or change something. You never really know how that goes to work out. But you can promise as a participation worker or as a youth worker that you're committed to trying to make that change with them in the direction that they want. And really importantly, feeding back and showing examples of changes that have been made by young people in other settings, in other contexts, or the group of young people you had in the project last year. What did they do? What difference did they make? And so that people can see that actually they do have a voice, they are able to influence things. They can always have more voice and they can always influence more things, but really keeping that cycle of going and saying, you are capable of shifting and doing something in your society because you have fundamentally a right to be heard, to be listened to.
And thanks to take this chance on the really big question out there. Let's take the next one and come to more practical, down-to-earth question. I'm picking up one from Ardita, who asks about the role of online platforms for debating. What's the role? Are those safe spaces for youth, and what's the contribution it can done also in connection to research?
Cristina, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to jump in there?
I could perhaps, maybe I'll take it off, and then I'm sure you'll have okay. Additional things. I mean, it's really quite interesting because I think we're probably speaking broadly, even outside of this current emergency, but the role of online platforms for debating in general, whether it's in peacetime or it's in this current time that we're in right now. I think of course, our online platforms have an incredible ability and potential for widespread type of participation, again, for all of the young people who are able to be online and are able to access it. You don't have the restrictions of needing to organize people to show up to a specific place or need to be in a room, and the resource constraints of that. You can do it anytime, anywhere in the world. I think that online platforms for debate do get difficult. And I think that our democracies and our societies, broadly speaking, are facing that challenge in the sense of both the kind of structural challenge or the technical challenge even of the fact that, often a lot of debates, when you're behind your computer and behind a screen and perhaps you have 240 characters, maybe you're not able to express the way in which you think you would be able to when you're face-to-face in person with other people. I think as well too, we know from Twitter, from Facebook and other platforms, even through WhatsApp messaging platforms, that also the proliferation of misinformation and all of that also skews our debates. Basically, you can search and Google for any kind of viewpoint or opinion that you have, and you'll be able to find something that backs it up. And I think that has also made it an additional challenge for us to have these kinds of debates, because there's no longer the sort of hegemony of only a few certain sources, certainly news sources, that help to inform the debate. You actually have an entire multiplicity of sources which are informing this debate, which can make it more difficult. The safe spaces question is a really interesting one. And I think for young people in particular, we think of safe spaces as also being a challenge when you have anonymity there, when you also have the ability to sort of to say things and to accuse things or threaten things without necessarily any repercussion. And I think that is something that we are trying to constantly figure out as a society, in terms of how can we have young people online in a free society, enabling free debate and open debate, but as well ensuring that it's safe for people. And just to say as well too, safety doesn't necessarily only mean safety from the people you are debating online, but also safety in terms of our privacy, in terms of the role of these of the large
Cristina,
tech
Cristina, I think we could make an entire session on only debating on digital platforms, but I would like to get forward to a few more questions, and I have another big scale question. Maybe Dan is today our expert for the big scale questions.
Are you saying that?
So a question from Anna. Basically, now with the focus on disaster risk reduction and the mitigation and response, youth agendas is in her observation that are even more lower in priority for decision makers than before. So how can we keep youth agenda and participation in focus?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I think it's probably very accurate to say that many political agendas are slipping compared to the COVID agenda, the disaster agenda. I think there are some choices for anyone who's in a sort of campaigning position or an advocacy position to make right now as to if it's the right time to push particular campaigns because or particular advocacy positions, because that takes your resources, that takes your time. To give you a kind of calmer example, I know a lot of advocacy organisations in the UK have basically been saying for a while, well, Brexit is the main political agenda. It's not really worth trying to do anything nationally other than that, because that's the political situation of the country. So they save their resources for the campaigns in the areas where they can make a difference on, maybe at local or regional level. But having said that, if we aren't vocal as a sector right now, if youth civil society doesn't come together and highlight the importance of it, then there will be many competing agendas or other places who will come forward and say, actually, it's important to resource this, it's important to keep up that. So I think the important thing is probably to come together as a sector to represent the importance of investing in young people and youth issues generally, to present young people as a part of a solution, part of actors who can help resolve this kind of issue, but also to highlight some of the particular risks that are more likely to be affecting them than other groups. So we know that people in precarious employment situations or manual employment situations are going to be much harder hit than people in what you might call middle-class jobs or well-paid jobs, people who can stay at home and go on Zoom to do their work. That will mean that a lot of young people are very much more affected. So it's really important to pay attention to what the disproportionalities are and raise those issues politically, and keep pushing in a sort of common campaign, really, around the importance of investing in young people and the importance of making sure we keep up support for young people.
Thank you very much. So coming now from advocacy to research. But before I go into the question, I have to highlight that Mr. Martin Martinson loves the haircut of you, Dan, and loves the pictures on your wall, Cristina. So Cristina, this goes out to you, this question. Now, what he is writing is that there is now new research coming up in studying the effects of the crisis in different spheres of life. So what new research would be necessary in the field of youth participation research in the near future to address this changed circumstances?
What new research would be necessary? So kind of taking a guess at what would be useful coming up for youth participation. I mean, I think, of course, within the digital sphere, and I mean, we've been talking about this for years in terms of this as an upcoming topic, as if it has never arrived fully. But I think that youth participation online during this time would be really remarkable to observe. And I'm hoping that there is research going on there in terms of tracking these types of ways in which young people are taking advantage, because now they're forced to be online more than ever before. I think that also with, in particular, some new mediums of youth participation, for example, that youth organizations are trying to access to reach out more to young people. We can think about, even the World Health Organization using TikTok in particular to spread COVID messages and to get young people to social distance and do those kinds of things, to take those measures. I think to look at the efficacy of that, to see, are these mediums also helping organizations that want to reach out to youth? Are they engaging in the way that they hope? Is that having an impact? Other side effects in terms of youth participation in studies, certainly the broader question of closing civic spaces in times of emergencies is going to be a pressing one, which will have huge ramifications for youth activism. And we can already see in Hungary, for example, the overstretch of that emergency time in terms of closing down on civic spaces. And I think that will need to be watched, particularly because, as Dan had mentioned, for young people, perhaps in the current moment, the direct effect is not felt as much as the older populations. However, young people will bear the brunt of the long-term effects of this crisis, particularly the social and economic instability that will follow. And so I think that it will be key to watch that and what that means for our civic spaces as well.
Yeah, I think there's a really good question from Carla here who says, in a moment of crisis like the current one, how do we pass from these micro-scale actions that every citizen should be implementing to the decision-making sphere? And I think there's something, she goes on to say something like, now that platforms are replacing the streets, how do we maintain political participation of youth? So I think there's a couple of things that research can do right now, which would be around actually keeping track of who's engaging in what and what are the key messages that are coming out so that they can be fed into the political system, because there's definitely a disconnect there between the groups that are online talking about things and the decision-making structures we have in our society. And then there's that kind of long-term thing that you just talked about, Cristina, which is that what effect has this had on the way we do participation as a whole? Because this rapid digitalization we're going through will have fundamentally done that. And that will impact on things, the way young people think about European citizenship. I can see Marco's mentioned that in the comments. How will it change people's perceptions of Europe and the way they feel about Europe as a whole? But I think really for me, the most pressing need in a research-wise is to do some very, very rapid things around who is being excluded here, whose voices are not being heard. Some stuff that can be done, let's say, quick and dirty research, because it'll be, I'm sure me and Cristina will be for years writing about the effect of Corona on youth participation and when we look back on the different changes that it created. But actually, for me, the point of research and the point of this is to make the world a better place for young people. And the pressing need, I think, is to really look at who's been most affected, how they're being most affected, and to feed that into policy making right now. And that can be done through participative mechanisms, through structures like the youth forums of the world and the national youth councils paying attention to that. But I think researchers also have a role to do that as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So I've identified two questions regarding citizenship and values. So Integrados Mundo asks how we can keep young people engaged with European values, and if there is not a common European response to the crisis, and how we as Erasmus Plus field is going to address this, and Saltos. And Marko Kovacic also adds the question if this crisis didn't demonstrate a lack of European citizenship. So how are we going to address this?
I think for me, there's something about when we say keeping young people engaged in European values, that means keeping them engaged in shaping what European values are and what Europe is. I think if we come from an approach of saying Europe is about believing in this, this, and this, and you must all now believe in it, young people, because that's what European means, that doesn't feel like democracy to me, it doesn't feel like rights to me, and it doesn't feel like participation to me. So I think taking the basic pillars of things like human rights and democracy as a starting point, what we need as a society as a whole is to be having continual conversations with young people and all people in society about what our citizenship means, what Europe's citizenship means. And that's a conversation that has to happen through the education systems, through our political systems, and just to be a continual thing. It's not about reaching a point of concluding what European citizenship means. It's about recognizing we're in a live and ongoing network of communities and nations that will evolve over time and will change over time, really. So, it's a tough question to say, does the crisis prove we don't have European citizenship or doesn't? Because actually what it feels to be a European and to some people might be different to others, and that's okay. We can have different relationships with Europe because there are many, many different citizens and people in Europe. I don't know what, Cristina, maybe you want to come in and think about that a little bit. You've done a lot of work outside of Europe. I mean, what do you see differently when you look comparatively between places?
I mean, I think comparatively, perhaps within this crisis is a little bit early to say. I guess then maybe reflecting on this concept of European values, European citizenship. I mean, I think as well too, just for us to be reminded as well within these kinds of concepts, we do also in Europe have a vast, very large and significant population of undocumented migrants, of unaccompanied minors, and of refugees. And I think that is also part of our European conversation. And in particular, if we talk about vulnerability in this crisis, they're perhaps among the most vulnerable, both in terms of the housing considerations and the fact that often they are in informal settlements, which makes overcrowding and that kind of thing a huge health concern, but also in terms of their informality, which their precarious nature with putting them in danger in terms of increased surveillance tactics with requiring IDs, for example, immediately puts certain migrants at risk. And I think that these are also big questions interwoven with what it is, what is our European response. It's heartening, and I only know very sort of topically about what's happening in Portugal, but the concept of then granting all refugees and asylum seekers for this period citizenship to be able to access then very basic services that are offered to Portuguese citizens in terms of healthcare and in terms of other social services, I think is also a consideration. What does it mean to be a citizen and not, and how does that really affect very basic civic and human rights and in this particular health crisis that we have here? And so I think that these are all very big questions that are difficult to.
So once again, at this stage, I would like to, from the global scale, big conceptual questions, come down to very practical questions that have been raised. One is coming from Flavia, who asks, in their NGO work, they're organizing often talks in an informal way between young people and decision makers, but they're having troubles coming up with outputs and follow up for this project. And I would like to add a second question to this from Flavio Ramos from Porto, who asks about approaches for strategies in the field of youth participation for cities. So is there any advice for cities that are developing such approaches? How do we approach youth participation on this local level?
So the first question, maybe I'm not understanding right. I'm hearing that more about how do you make a change, or you could also hear it about how do you kind of count that in a project format, really. I suppose, first of all, the fact that you're getting regular contact between decision makers and the young people you're working with is a really, really important part of creating change. And particularly when you're working at local or city level, for me, it's about where you start to see change is when you step away a little bit, I think, from this protesting and pushing vision of participation. We run a campaign and we wave some banners and we tell the city decision makers to do something different. And when you move deliberately to more deliberative participation, where you're sitting down, having regular contact between groups of young people, city decision makers, to talk about and think about the issues in a particular community, whether that's a city, a neighborhood, or even a particular group of people within that community. And that's where you start to generate ideas between the two parties as to how you might change things. And you kind of have to build up a relationship of trust between the decision makers and between the young people that are involved in these kind of programs. So I joke a little bit, but when you move from talking about youth representative chair of this organization talking to ministerial representative here, and you can bring it to the human level of this is Dave talking to Patrick, then you can start to build relationships and connections, and people start to value the input they've got on both sides and work towards a progressive thing. But I think if you think about that on a city scale, one of the other important things to think about is to really look at the numbers of young people you're engaging with. Not every young person is going to want to be heavily involved in designing and writing policies and co-managing structures. But actually, if you want to make a population level change in the way an entire city interacts with its institutions, with young people, you need to be working with a very significant proportion of young people in that city. And that could just mean simply having really good communications and informations campaigns that feed back how decisions are made, why decisions were made, where you could go to influence something or raise something. And, there's some really interesting things that happen in cities like Cascais in Portugal, where they're doing large-scale participatory budgeting approaches and that sort of thing. So for me, it's about working on both very, very human and interpersonal level, but also thinking on that whole population level as well. Yeah, that would be my thoughts for you. Again, you could talk for a whole webinar on just that topic.
True. Before we continue, I would like to raise another topic that came up, and that might be already the last bigger topic that we are picking up on, the role of youth workers in political participation. There's a question from Marco Santos, who would like to ask advice on the role of youth workers, to understand what's the role for supporting political participation, how to create a positive stereotype in the topic, so youth workers would be able to inspire and be a role model for young people when they are not involved anyways. Your thoughts on that? Maybe Cristina?
I mean, youth work in comparison to Dan is actually not exactly my specialization. I know, broadly speaking, there is a larger conversation about this idea of perhaps bringing the political back more into youth work, and having a bit more of sort of a values base to be operating from, in terms of sort of that role of the youth worker in shaping values and also shaping, kind of a political identity in that way. I would just say that I know Jugend for Europa was planning a conference on this particular topic, and so I just want to plug that. Unfortunately, it's not happening at the current scheduled time, but it will be coming, and it is a bigger conversation. So I hope to still be a part of that. But maybe Dan has some specific reflection.
Yeah, I mean,
your research.
they've just done a paper, actually. I can see that the author of the paper, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Yael Owner, is in the comments, which covers just these. But I think for me, there's a couple of things. One is to think about the locus of change. If you talk about youth work as an educational package, we tend to think that what we're trying to do is change the young people we're working with in some way, to give them more skills or some more competencies. For me, as a youth worker, I've always tried to flip that 360 degrees. So what I'm interested in is changing the social environment, the cultural environment, and the political environment that the young people are in, and working with that. I don't really care if a young person in my youth work projects learns something or not. What I care is if they're able to create social and political change as a result of it. And that straight away takes you to a political space. Sometimes I think we get scared off by the word political because we think that it means party politics and politicians, but it doesn't. It's about power and it's about change. and thinking about designing interventions which enable young people to make those changes. So going back to that question earlier about if you've got young people sitting down with decision makers, how do I understand the outputs of that for a project? What I'm more interested in is not have the young people learned something, but have the attitudes of the decision makers change, have the decision makers done something differently in their institutions and in their policies as a result of their engagement with the young people. Not that I'm dismissing learning and education at all, but that's a different thing for participation for me. It's a thing that enables it, but really seeing that whole spectrum of what are you trying to change with participation. I struggle a bit with the difference between political and non-political participation. For me, all participation is political. I can't imagine a type of participation that isn't political unless you're using the word in a very different way, like you might take part in a sports team or take part in a theatre production, which is just, to me, is just a different word and a different use of the word that sometimes gets mixed up in our multi-language societies. But yeah, that would be my thinking anyway. I'd really recommend anyone to look at that paper. I was reading it just today. Perhaps we can post it in the comments for people to see.
All right, we are time-wise coming closer to the end of our session already. So I would like just to ask if there is any thoughts on the whole conversation, things that you would still like to emphasize before we round this up.
Do you want to start, Cristina? I feel like I've talked a lot.
Yeah, sure. I mean, closing thoughts, it's a really unprecedented time that we're in. And I think really the role of people who work with young people, those of us in youth researchers, but as well as those within youth organizations who are supporting youth participation, those in youth policy, policymakers who do have youth within their banner. I think that really this particular time, while in a way is forcing a type of pause for the types of activities and work that we normally would do, I think is actually the prime moment for us to actually prepare. I think that what will come next is really what the big crisis will be, and that will be much more long lasting. And again, that will be, of course, the oncoming economic fallout from the crisis, and then all of the attendant things around that, certainly as well, the strain on our health systems, our education systems, the fact that a lot of young people are simply 91% of young people in the world currently right now are out of school. And that is likely to continue for half a year to a year, perhaps longer. And so that is also will require some new imagination for us who are educators and other people who are supporting young people. And certainly not to understate even just the types of mental health challenges that will come out from the fact that young people are simply, are having to survive this crisis, the same as all the rest of us, but also without the support and the social networks that they're used to from their schools, from their families, as well as other caregivers, extended families and relatives. And so I think that our role as a youth sector is really to then get ready to look at the hazards that may be coming down the road that are not here yet, to prepare and position ourselves to be able to campaign and advocate for protective policies that are going to, at first place, protect the human rights of children and young people, but also to support their restoration and getting back to school, getting back to those activities and that support, and to really be prepared and to help to anticipate that. That's what I would say.
I think that's really good. You already answered the question that also I read from Carla, who has posted the question on what the strategy would be to rebuild and recover from that situation when the doors are open. So how we should rethink and reshape the priorities. I think you have covered that really well now. Dan?
Yeah, I think final thoughts. First of all, I can see there's a question from Karina asking if we can post it on YouTube with captions and subtitles. I can certainly, we can certainly make a transcription of this. I'm not quite sure if I can do subtitles, but I can definitely show Kadri a way to do a transcription. My final thought is not to overcomplicate this. We've had a lot of really difficult questions, really big questions, and participation doesn't work if the only people who can support it and think about it need to have extensive years of experience and qualifications. Participation is a day-to-day practice in young people's everyday lives. For us to be serious about thinking about young people being valued as citizens, about young people being able to be listened to, about young people being able to be active, that means the maths teacher who only half has ever heard of youth participation, or the politician whose main interest is supporting the military, needs to listen to and respect young people. Absolutely everyone in our public institutions needs to value young people. So we need to make the ways we talk about it accessible, simple, and we need to not scare people off with this. How do you change Europe's dimensions of citizenships, or how do you overthrow the system? Actually, some of our conversations need to be about how does that 17-year-old young person, when they're in school, feel like they're valued as a person and an individual with human rights, and how do they feel like that they can go to a person, an institution, a body, to tell people when they think things are different, should be different, and to act to make things different in our society. It's really important not to lose track of participation being an everyday practice and citizenship being an everyday practice as well. That's most people's contact with the world around them is on the day-to-day human level, I think. But yeah, those are my final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Thank you very much, Dan, for being here with us today. Thank you all out there, 123 viewers, for being with us. As we said before, this is not the last webinar that we are hosting. The next one is gonna be up on April 24th. You can register for it on the Salto Youth website. Thank you very much for watching, and have a very nice Easter weekend.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Be
everyone.
safe.
Bye.
Be healthy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.